Hey there. Happy Saturday. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Total Ramblings. This episode's a day late because I've gone and got COVID, haven't I? For 6 years I've managed to avoid this thing and I've gone and got COVID. And I don't feel very good. But I'm here drinking my Monster. It's Saturday, May the 3rd, 2025. And I've just watched episode 5 of series 2 of Andor. This is my immediate reaction to that episode. There will be spoilers. And yes, I'm still doing video reviews because I've got a schedule to keep up, man. And I'm not letting COVID beat me. So there you go. Right. This episode is entitled, I Have Friends Everywhere. And it's full of intrigue and lots of underground rumblings wherever you look. I'm going to go over the different areas that we're sort of focusing on. We start off, as the Andor logo sort of slowly rotates, we hear a radio tuning, and Luthen Rael's assistant, Claire, in Luthen's art gallery, is tuning in her listening equipment, and as we discover, is playing back a recording from Davo Skulden's place where they've planted a bug. I thought it was quite cool that one of the artifacts in Luthen Rael's art gallery is a giant Roman-style dodecahedron, one of those mystery objects that we don't know what it's for, but this is a huge one. Anyway, Skulden has discovered that something in one of the items in his art collection is a forgery, and basically everything has to be checked, and Luthen and Claire start to argue and panic as they realise that there's going to be a party and everything's going to be checked after the party, which means that their microphone is going to be discovered. So they have to sort that out. There's another scene with Luthen where Bix, Cassian Andor's partner, she is alone in her safe house apartment, and Luthen pays her a visit. I have to say, major Blade Runner vibes in the safe house with the way it was lit and the sort of lighting coming through the window as traffic passes overhead, the sort of swooping noise of the vehicles. Very Blade Runner. Clearly an homage to that, I would think. Anyway, he was going to send her on a mission, but he finds that she's been taking drugs. Spice, glitter stim, if I recall. He says he needs her healthy. She says she's just taking it to help her sleep, and he says it works for a little while, but then the nightmares come back. So that's kind of what's happening with Luthen and Claire. Meanwhile, we have Cassian Andor on his way to Gorman, and as he's getting to the spaceport, you can hear, he meets with a contact, and you can hear the cover story that he's being given, where he's from, why he's going to Gorman, where he lives, how long he's lived there, what his trade is, his profession, etc., etc. When Andor arrives on Gorman, he's taken to a hotel room which looks directly out at the site of the earlier Gorman massacre, and we find out that indeed, as per Star Wars EU / sort of Legends lore, because the EU became Legends, Grand Moff Tarkin wanted to land a cruiser, and there was a group of unarmed citizens, about 500 of them, as we've heard earlier, and he just landed the cruiser on top of them and killed them all. And obviously there's a monument right in the city centre exactly where it happened, and it's clearly a very sore point amongst the locals. Andor is out one night eating food at a restaurant, and Rylance's daughter Enza comes to meet him unexpectedly, and he basically berates her for being careless, because he could have been anybody. He could have been ISB, and he says we need to be more careful. The next day, he visits Rylands under cover of him being a designer and looking at their fabric, because Gorman, the planet Gorman, is known for producing twill. And he says, hey, there was a rebel pilot trapped in the mountains and we gave you a special radio. And basically, it's clear that since that point, Luthen has been in contact with Rylands. And Rylands says, well, it's just a voice at the end of a radio. I don't know who it is. I don't know who you are. Anyway, Rylands says, look, we're trying to find out what the Imperials are building in the middle of the city. We think it's an armory. And we've got a source inside, and clearly referring to Cyril Khan, who we'll come to in a minute. Andor says, you realise that giving false information is exactly what the Empire does. And indeed, that is what is happening, but of course we don't know that. The information that's being given is not false, but it's being given for nefarious purposes, shall we say. But of course, Rylands doesn't need this. And he basically says, we've got information on the vehicles that are supplying equipment for the construction. Basically, we want you to advise what's happening. And Andor undertakes some investigations with them. Andor is concerned that the Gorman front can't do the job on their own. And Rylands is not impressed with him or Luthen. It says, you're not much of a revolutionary, are you? This ties in closely, of course, with the other main thread in this episode, which is that Cyril Khan, working at the Imperial Bureau of Standards, is working in his office, and he's talking with his mum, and we know that the Gorman front, the rebels, are listening into his conversations, and he says he's going home at the weekend to his mum, he's going back to Coruscant, and a team of ISB techs turn up and say, we think you're being bugged. Cyril kind of gets arrested and questioned. I couldn't help but notice that when Cyril comes back to his office, he's got a walkway to his office at the end, and there are pits on either side where his workers are. And it's the layout is basically that of the bridge of an Imperial Star Destroyer. The Empire is very clearly into, authority by putting people literally on a platform above their workers. I thought that was an interesting sort of parallel. Anyway, the ISB techs say, well, they found a listening device. And of course, everyone's under suspicion now. The Gorman front have been looking at Cyril Khan's previous record, and they find that he was on Morlana 1, which we saw in Series 1 of Andor, and that he was fired by the ISB with full dishonour. And they think they have their man. They think they have their internal contact. Cyril meets with Rylands. This is obviously all happening intertwined with the other stories with Cassie and Andor, right? And it's interesting because Rylands says that many people think the Emperor doesn't know what's being done on his behalf, and they think the ISB is running a shadow government. Now, this reminds me very much of the early days of Nazi Germany, where Hitler had secured power with his Nazi party, and what was happening was certain peoples were being oppressed and hassled and shot and imprisoned and put in concentration camps. And yet many of the German citizens at the time, they just kind of thought, oh, well, it's all being done. The Fuhrer doesn't know what's happening, and these people are just over-enthusiastic, and it's not the Fuhrer that's ordering these things, and he's a lovely man, and he's not to blame. And I'm getting a sense of that here, in that people are saying, well, it's not the Emperor's fault that people are over-enthusiastic. It's people are taking it the wrong way. And it's kind of interesting sort of parallels there. Anyway, basically, as I've already sort of implied, they're trying to get information out of Cyril about what's on these transport carriers, and they want to know what kind of facilities being built. So Cyril starts to hand over the data, and there's a reference on some of this stuff. MSR, military security required. Anyway, Cyril, as planned, goes back home to Coruscant and very briefly pops in to see Dedra. He says, I was very careful coming here. She says, I know, I had you followed. And he's like, don't believe that. And he's basically, he can only stay an hour because they are concerned that people from the Gorman front could be following him and probably watching his mum's apartment, because they know he's in regular communication with his mum. They know he's on Coruscant to visit his mum, and they want to make sure, I guess, that they've got the right man for their intel. And Dedra kind of says, well, you can only be here an hour, turn out the lights, where presumably they do the naughty. Don't know. Anyway, Cyril again goes and visits and presumably stays with his mum. He seems to have got the measure of her a bit more lately, or at least I think their relationship might be a little bit more respectful. But then has a briefing with Dedra and Major Partagaz, and basically we can kind of see that the plot is that there's a plan to bait Gorman as a target for outside agitators. So, and the ISB, Major Partagaz says, well, Major Partagaz and Dedra have a discussion, and she's like, they need to be very careful with their retribution, and the Gorman front needs to see what it is to win to start with, because basically they want an excuse to ramp up the military presence on the planet and their oppression against the Gore so they can get what they want from the planet. And so they want to be seen to be the squeaky clean good guys, and so they are trying to provoke rebels into committing various atrocities so that, you know, they can justify their occupation. And then after the briefing, Cyril says, this is the greatest day of his life. And Dedra says, well, it's nice to see you happy. The final sort of thread that we're following is that Willman is with Saw Gerrera's rebels, and he's showing one of the personnel variations in how to synthesize rhydonium, the starship fuel. Saw seemingly wants to get rid of Willman because he says he's seen too much. And Saw's man says, look, I've got all these variations in my head. I need to know which station we're hitting so I can refine it down to one. Saw tells him. But and there's a scene later on where Saw says to Willman, is this other man ready to do the synthesizing? And he says yes. And it looks like Saw's going to kill Willman, but instead he shoots his own man and says that he's been transmitting to the Empire, and the information he gave him was false, and that in fact they're going to be many parsecs away. And then there's a fantastic scene where Saw basically says, pack up your stuff, we're leaving this base. And Saw's rebels, with a transport and at least 8 X-Wing fighters that I recall, they leave the planet and jump to hyperspace. Fantastic graphics there. They are raiding a fuel station on some kind of remote moon, and they are using the rhydonium device to synthesize the fuel. And whilst Willman is working through the combination, Saw is telling a story about a rhydonium leak that he was previously, exposed to. And he appears to be quite mad, kind of intoxicated by the rhydonium, which is highly, highly, highly toxic, right? I looked this up, and rhydonium is like a sort of silvery, kind of mercury-looking sort of material, basically used in starship engines for hyperdrive, that kind of thing. And Saw is kind of giving a speech to Willman, and he's saying, you should kind of encouraging him to kind of breathe in the rhydonium fumes. And he's like, we'll all be dead before the Republic is back. And yet here we are. And Willman is kind of sucked into Saw's insanity, I guess. So, yeah. And that's really where we end the episode. As usual with Andor, we have these 3 episode chunks, and there's usually like an explosion of action in the final sort of episode, which I'm probably going to be looking at almost immediately and recording my next video. But another great episode, really, really heavy on the sort of discussion, exposition and plot and intrigue. a real sense of paranoia as we see the ISB looking to undermine the rebellion, and of course, elements of the rebellion looking to undermine the Empire, and how all these plots are tying together. And it's fascinating stuff, and this is exactly the sort of Star Wars that I like. So I'm going to go away now. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Total Ramblings. I will see you in the next episode, whatever that might be. Please do all the usual YouTubey stuff, like, subscribe, comment, share, etc., etc., and I will see you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.